Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about the market for data, buying and selling data, certainly a red hot market. We'll look at trends in the data market, and we'll dig into some key issues like privacy. To discuss that, I'm joined by Nick Jordan, founder and CEO of Narrative.io. Nick, thanks for being with us today.
James, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about data. We're probably going to use that four-letter word, no less than 1,000 times over the next couple of minutes.
I like that. So how was your week this week? Is it a good week, bad week? Are you just happy to be at Friday? What is the world according to Nick Jordan today?
I am happy it's Friday. I'm in New York City. The weather has been rainy and cold and gloomy for the last week and a half. Looks like the weekend's going to be nice. Looks like we're going to get into the 70s next week. So I'm optimistic to get this week behind us and get next week started.
There you go. Great. All right. So data, I mean, it never fails to amaze me. In the business world these days, everything leads to data. So many decisions are made by looking at the metrics. I was talking to an artificial intelligence expert, and he said to me, the algorithms are great, the software is great, but what we really need is vast troves of data to shovel into the algorithms to really get competitive insight from them. So data is everything. From where you sit, and you're very close to the market, what's happening in data these days? What are a couple key trends in the year 2022 driving things forward?
Yeah, I actually think that talk track, that the algorithms are great and the outcomes are great, but we need more data is actually spot on. You've actually seen a lot of the big companies like Google and Facebook and others actually open source their AI algorithms and technologies. One of the reasons they do that is obviously to get the input and sort of feedback loop from a larger audience, but it's also because they know that they have all of the data, and therefore the algorithms are going to work better for them than folks that don't have the data. And so I think one of the trends that we're seeing is people have fallen in love with the concept of using their own data to generate great outcomes, either in the form of just plain analytics or machine learning or AI. But a lot of them are seeing that the data they have is not sufficient to solve the problems that they're tackling. And so if the last decade was about organizations sort of organizing their own data to get their own house in order, I think the next 10 years is really about them focused on outcomes, and those outcomes are largely going to be driven not just by using their own data, but augmenting it with data that may come from other sources.
So in other words, they need to go out in the marketplace and buy data. So people are obviously buying and selling data in an open market. I'm going to assume that market is a fairly new market, and perhaps some of the rules and costs are not really codified really clearly.
Yeah, I will say I don't know if that it's a new market. I think data brokers have existed in one form or another probably for longer than I've been alive. I do think it is a market that is quickly getting more efficient, and so I think the other big change that we're seeing around data is that historically data has been human scale, so things that fit in an Excel document or in a PDF in the form of a report, or for very sophisticated organizations maybe a relational database. I think as you move into the era of ML and AI, now the data actually needs to be machine scale. Machines don't want simplicity, they want specificity, and they want raw tonnage. And so to the extent that the data marketplace is immature, I think it's immature around that class of data, where the data is much more, much larger, much more specific, and largely going to be consumed by an algorithm or by a computer, and not by a person. There are folks that are already participating in that market. It still tends to be very inefficient. The sort of my layman take on it is, I'm old enough to, when you used to book a vacation, you would go to a travel agent, and you would sit down and tell them what you wanted to do, and they would come back a week and a half later with a proposed itinerary. No one does that anymore. Now they now they either use an online travel agent or they just book everything themselves. I think we're seeing that level of efficiency start to come into the data market.
So in other words, people are actually buying and selling their own data with less emphasis on a middleman?
That's exactly right. I mean, if you think of a data broker as a middleman, I think they were sort of something that was needed early on, because it was you couldn't, just like with travel, you couldn't necessarily go directly to the airline without showing up at the airport, and no one wanted to drive to the airport. I think brokers created a market that largely got us to where we are today. But along the way, they actually create a bunch of opacity between the buy side and the sell side, right? The data supply chain becomes more opaque. They also take a lot of the value for themselves, like any good middleman does. And I think largely their incentives are misaligned with the incentives of the companies that are actually doing the buying and selling.
So, all right, there's all these companies that are out there in the marketplace. They're buying data, they're selling data. What's a common problem the companies face with their data strategy, acquiring it, selling it, buying it, handling it? Any advice you would give as close as you are to the market?
Yeah, well, we talk about data as if it's this homogenous asset, and it's clearly not. It comes in an infinite number of forms. And so where a lot of the time is spent today is around normalization, in the technical sense. Okay, I have a data set that, has a certain schema or data dictionary, and I need to transform it into another one. But oftentimes, well before the actual physical transformation of the data happens, there's sort of, hours of endless calls between business development people and lawyers and salespeople and product managers and engineers. And so, I think the trick to ultimately making this market more efficient is coming up with ways where the data can actually be shared across multiple parties in a way where the data cleansing and the data standardization doesn't become 80% of the work. It may not be any of the work at all, or 5% of the work. And those are the types of problems that we're really focused on. Is, how do you let everyone continue to speak their language, because everyone is most efficient in speaking their own language and not someone else's. And if you can do that, it sort of changes the calculus in terms of how people think about both monetization and acquisition.
So is that a question of the ETL process, extract, transform, and load, built into it somehow? How do we solve that problem?
Yeah, it is. Although, most folks are now moving from ETL to ELT. And so, think of it as the difference between doing something at compile time versus runtime. One of the things that I like to tell organizations as they're thinking about their data strategy is, you're not as smart as you think you are. And so the more business rules you apply up front, the less optionality you have on the back end. And so certainly there is a form of ELT where it's, store the data in its original form, and not until you actually want to access it and do it something do you actually do the transformation. And then one of the functions that we serve is, okay, if there's multiple organizations, even ELT is hard, because the buy side doesn't know how the sell side stores their data. They don't really want to understand the nuance of schema and things like that. And so we have an engine that sits in the middle of our platform called Rosetta Stone that basically semantically classifies data that's in the platform. And so now everyone can refer to the data as sort of as part of a standard knowledge graph, if you will. So in the same way, Google, if you search New York City or Big Apple or NYC, in the Google Knowledge Graph, it knows you're talking about the same thing. We've applied those same concepts to a data ecosystem where someone says, I want air temperature, or I want event timestamp. And regardless if the temperature is stored as Fahrenheit or Celsius, or if the timestamp is in local time or UTC time, or no matter what format it might be stored in, you're effectively getting the same information out of the system.
Can you give me an example of, and you spoke about this a little bit, example of a company that would be buying data and one that would be selling it? So it's like, say, an unnamed insurance company is going to sell, a certain amount of registrations, not the names, of course, but then someone would want to buy that insurance, registration information. I mean, what's a use case for a buying and a selling instance?
Yeah, so they're infinite. I will give you some specific examples, but I would sort of think of buying and selling data as equivalent to a database that people are either writing data to the database, or they're selecting data from the database. The use cases are almost innumerable. Some interesting ones. We work with some companies that sell weather data on the platform. So again, in this zip code at this time, it was this temperature, it was raining, it was snowing, etc. And we also have folks on the platform that are selling transactional data. So data that's collected from point of sale terminals or from credit card companies, etc. And so you have a lot of direct to consumer brands. You have a lot of retailers that are doing analytics to try to understand how weather patterns actually impact in-store sales or online sales, for that matter. And so they're actually taking data sets from multiple entities, some around transactional data, some around weather data, they can actually commingle their own data as part of these and start to answer questions of, am I selling more in store on nice sunny days versus online on rainy days? And then how do I actually change my strategy if that's true? Do I try to time my sales to when, where, we think there's going to be bad weather or good weather, et cetera. And so, they're asking themselves pretty, I don't want to say basic questions, but they're asking the same questions they may have asked, well before data, was used so prevalently. They can just now answer those questions much more quickly and using data that they might not have had endemically.
Interesting. So what about the question of privacy? Obviously, it's really a hot button question these days. There's all sorts of new regulations about privacy and compliance. I mean, how is the industry handling that?
Yeah, well, I guess going back to the data broker conversation that we were having, to the extent that you have someone in the middle that's creating opacity, that's sort of removing, the trend, the view into the supply chain, that causes all sorts of problems, because how do you know if you're compliant if you don't know where the data came from or you don't know where the data is going to? So I think, first and foremost, I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more companies can actually see the end-to-end supply chain, the easier it is for them to conform to those laws. Second is I've read GDPR, I've read CCPA, I've read bits of the HIPAA legislation. As with any good laws, there's ambiguities and they're interpreted in entirely different ways. And so,
Sure.
I think making sure that the participants in any marketplace or on our platform can make their own decisions as to, how they view the regulations, what their risk tolerance is important. And again, I think that's why not having a middleman who's making the decisions for you, but letting you make strategic decisions as an organization is so important. And then, maybe my favorite point to make around this is not all data is consumer data. I know if you were to read the Wall Street Journal or, publications, it's, all you see is Facebook and how scary data is. Right. We have, companies in the platform that have data on carbon credits. We have people on the platform that have data on crop yields of in sort of the agriculture technology field. As of this interview, I don't think the corn has any, explicit or implicit privacy rights. And so the privacy conversation really only applies to a small subset of the overall data that we're talking about as part of the marketplace.
Right. No, the corn nor the zucchini is probably not too concerned with privacy. It's important to
yeah, zucchini has a it's known to be a little finicky when it comes to the privacy stuff.
Well, let's talk about your company narrative. I mean, how do you address the data needs of your clients? I mean, what is the narrative advantage?
Yeah, so if we go back to the data broker model, traditionally data brokers are a sales and services business, right? You hop on the phone, you tell them what you want. Time passes, and maybe you get a portion of what you want, and the data broker gets a lot of money. We are very much a technology business. We are licensing technology to buyers and sellers to allow the buyers and sellers to own their own strategy and work together with each other, but to do it more efficiently. The reason people work with middlemen is it makes their lives easier, not because there's some implicit value in working with a middleman. And so if you can make the participant's life easier, be it on the buy side or the sell side, but you can do it in a way that they're not disintermediated and they can still control their various company strategies, we think that's a win-win. And again, we've seen this in travel, for going from a travel agent to booking directly with hotels and airlines. We've seen this with transport, calling up a taxi service versus using something like Uber. We've seen this in financial services. Recently, as a couple decades ago, there were people on a trading floor, with holding paper above their heads, yelling at each other, and now all of the trading is done electronically. And so we see it as a natural progression of taking something that is sort of inherently manual at the beginning and finding ways to automate it through technology.
So you talk about the absence of a middleman. So you're not the middleman. You're not selling big blocks of data. You're selling the technology to move the data. Explain.
Yeah,
that,
we've never bought or sold a single record of data. So, you can almost think of our system as an ERP for data. And I think we have sort of some secondary value where we're almost an escrow service as well. So seller puts their data, into the platform and then sets up their selling rules, who they'll sell to, how they would price it, the license under which when someone buys it, they have to adhere to. buyers can go into the platform and they have discovery functionality. They're able to define what they're trying to buy. They get some forecasting capabilities across the suppliers that have their data in the platform. They can set how much they're willing to pay, who they want to work with, and basically where the data itself, the sell side constraints and the buy side constraints all overlap, where that Venn diagram hits in the middle is where transactions happen. And then, those transactions are between the parties, the buyer and the seller. We're just facilitating those transactions. And then we're acting as the fulfillment engine, right? The Amazon Prime, if you will, where we're, helping the sellers get the data to the buyers as quickly and in as a usable of a format as possible.
So obviously then you are, to a certain extent, playing referee in some of the transactions, or it doesn't really work that way?
Yeah, referee might be a good way to put it. I think there's an inherent distrust between buyers and sellers of data, right? It's not like as a seller, you can hand the buyer your entire data set and then just say, well, just tell me, the stuff that you like and then only pay for that. Or just tell me the stuff that you use and just pay for that. I mean, once they have the data, they have the data.
Sure.
But oftentimes, the buyer, before they buy the data, want to understand how it's going to match up to their own data sets, or they're going to want to measure the quality of the data. And so instead of having any of those functions happen either in sort of the seller's ecosystem or the buyer's ecosystem, it happens in the narrative ecosystem. And we act as the escrow service / referee / the person that is Switzerland in this example. And then based on the rules that they enumerate to us, and they can enumerate any rules they want to about how they want those transactions to happen, only where those rules are met does the data actually get purchased, and do we send the data downstream.
Okay, that's really interesting. Let's look at the future of data and the way it would be bought and sold either in a platform like yours or other platforms. What do you see in the, say, 2 to 4 years out in the data market? What will be going on then?
Well, I think a lot of this becomes so normalized in everyday business and probably happens not necessarily in a platform that narrative provides, but powered by a platform that narrative provides. So you can imagine, if you want to, you're about to host a conference for your best customers, you may want to put a gift in their hotel room as they come to the conference. You might not know if they prefer wine or beer or chocolate or some other gift. Like you can imagine in your CRM being able to say, hey, I'd like to add a new column, which is sort of, preferred gift. And if you could actually buy for each of your customer records, like, what their passion is, so you could give them, the correct gift, you would do all that day. You'd probably spend, $500,000, $2,000 to do that as part of a conference that's costing you hundreds of thousands of dollars. Today, you would have to go find a data broker, or you'd have to come to something like Narrative, send your CRM over, say, here's what I'm looking for, then send the data back. That, it would still take time. If you can make that sort of a seamless part of any user experience, whether that's in a CRM or any other system that either consumes data or generates data, then the organizations start becoming much more data first, but not in a way that they feel like they have to have a degree in statistics or data science. They're just they're trying to answer a question, or they're trying to understand something. And I think data becomes not something for technologists in the future, it becomes something for every user within an organization, whether they think they're doing something data driven or not.
So it almost becomes the democratization of data, because people can find and search and buy and sell data without really being heavy duty technologists.
For sure, and that fundamentally changes everything. So we have an advisor at Narrative, and he recently bought a home and did all of this, standard research that you do when you buy a home. Looked at the quality of the schools in the school district, obviously looked at the price and the comps against other homes, and all the things that we do. Found a house, loved the house, moved in with his wife and his kids. Next morning after they move in, 5:30 in the morning, the neighbor fires up the Harleys that he goes for a ride with, every 5:30 in the morning. So he said to me, he goes, if when I was on Zillow, there was a way to sort of understand that my neighbor was a gearhead and was going to fire up his Harley every morning at 5:30 in the morning, I would have paid $1,000 for that, one data point, because I probably wouldn't have bought the house. And you know,
Right.
I don't think our primary focus right now is how do we, you know, give one person an answer to one question to help them buy or not buy a house, but you could
Right.
see how the prevalence of data could actually fundamentally change almost everything we do day to day.
And I'm sure that it will. Nick, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I learned a ton. It was fascinating. I hope you'll come back and talk with us again sometime.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.